With the authority of the Almighty God, we give, grant, and assign, in perpetuity, to you and your heirs, all the islands and the mainlands found, and to be found, discovered, and to be discovered, in the west and south, with all their dominions, cities, castles, towns, and villages.
Imagine a group of strangers walking into your home unannounced, pushing you and your family to the street because you don't practice their religion. This is essentially what was done to First Nations and Inuit by European colonizers. They did this under what is called the Doctrine of Discovery, which came from a series of authorizations called Papal Bulls, written in 1493.
Papal bulls really were a way of sort of dividing up the globe between different competing imperial Catholic powers, most notably Spain, and they were done by Pope Nicholas V and then his successor, Alexander VI. And the basic idea of the papal bulls were that these imperial powers had a religious responsibility to win these new lands and territories for the Catholic Church. And the kind of sweetener for them was that any lands or territories that were held by non-Christians were available for them to claim. So it effectively dispossessed indigenous people who at that time were not Christian.
So why does the Doctrine of Discovery have an effect on modern-day Canada? Well, it actually starts down south with a legal case in the United States over, well, you guessed it, Indigenous land.
This dispute ended up in the Supreme Court of the United States with a guy by the name of Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time.
The case was called Johnson and McIntosh, and in 1823, the court was deciding who owns a parcel of Indigenous land down in Illinois. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall heard the case. When it came time to write his decision, he didn't really rely on anything that was argued in front of him.
In his research, he came across this doctrine of discovery. And it is that you can, if you take up the lands, you have title to the lands. And that follows on this Pope's papal bull. And that was the way it became part of the law. It evolved on the basis of a legal fiction. There is no such thing as the law of doctrine of discovery. There is no such thing. He decided it, relied on the doctrine of discovery to come up with these legal principles that Indians never owned their lands. They weren't capable of owning their lands, and they were owned by whichever monarch discovered them.
And what happens in the United States usually ends up happening here in Canada. That brings us to 1888 and the St. Catharines Milling lumber ruling. The case was over whether Ontario or Canada had jurisdiction over non-reserve territory in Treaty 3. Canada issued the lumber company a license to harvest timber around Wabigoon Lake. Ontario challenged it, arguing it owned rights to timber in the area. They turned to the courts to decide who owned the trees. The case ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada, which said, in part, all this country was once occupied by Indian tribes. On its discovery by Europeans, the discoverers acquired a right of property in the soil, provided that discovery was followed by possession. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that Canada owned the land, but for decades, First Nations peoples have taken their land rights to every level of court in the country, from Vancouver to Halifax and the Arctic. The Supreme Court has heard it all, and it looks as though things are changing.
In modern times, we still have Aboriginal title. It's that right to occupy and use the land. We can't sell it to anybody. We have to get the consent of the Crown or the Canadian government. That's how our law has evolved. It's been on the fictional basis that the discovery gave the discoverer absolute title to our lands, and the Indians were left with nothing but right to occupy and use the land. It has value now because that use and occupation comes with a duty to consult, and that's a constitutional right for Indigenous people. In other words, if you want a corporation to use your land, you have to deal with the Aboriginal title. Before, that just never happened.
So if the Doctrine of Discovery is legal fiction, why doesn't the Vatican rescind it?
The problem is there's no mechanism for doing that. And my own personal theory about this is it has something to do with another 19th century doctrine, papal infallibility. If you want to project this image of an eternal, unchanging monolith, if you have these papal bulls and you rescind them, how is that going to affect your idea about papal infallibility? It's really going to call it into question. So I think probably what Pope Francis would prefer to do is what he did with residential schools, to say this was an error, but not necessarily rescind it, because there isn't a way to do that.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action call on every level of government and religious group to reject the doctrine of discovery. Land back is a common theme across the country now, as First Nations peoples call for the government to give back what is rightfully ours. Whether the government will actually honor the calls for land back, well, that's another story. The federal government passed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples law in Canada. It describes the doctrine of discovery as racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. So, will there be a day when Canada says enough is enough? Well, there seem now to be cracks forming in Canada over support of the doctrine of discovery in court. In a January 2022 ruling, Justice Nigel Kent of the Supreme Court of British Columbia essentially said that Canada's takeover is simply a colonial power grab. But former Justice Laforme believes it will never truly go away.
There'll be something else to take its place, because you can imagine the disruption and everything that it's going to cause. Maybe you have to go back and reassess the compensation or something like that for all of Canada to Indigenous people, and I just don't see that happening.
Hey everyone, Daryl Stranger here. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you just saw, you should check out some of our other videos, and you should also subscribe.